Back in January, when Donald Trump came to the White House, a dollar could buy 97 euro cents. At the time of making this video, it could only buy 88. Visualeconomik community, in the last few weeks, we've witnessed an unprecedented embarrassment. Donald Trump has bypassed all the checks and balances of the American political system to declare trade war on the entire world. The result? A case of capital flight that is more typical of Kirchner's Argentina than of the world's #1 power. We already have a video in which we explain the fall of the dollar in detail, but for a very brief summary, take a look at the following chart. This is the correlation between treasury bonds and the US stock market. Normally, the correlation is negative. That is, when the stock market goes up, bonds go down. And when the stock market falls, then bonds become more valuable. The reason is very obvious. US debt is the safe haven asset par excellence, a piece of paper that everyone wants, especially when things start to go wrong globally. Well, right now the correlation is positive. In other words, people are not fleeing to the stock market to buy US debt. Donald Trump has done so much damage to institutions that the market no longer sees the US as a safe haven, at least in the short term. But today we aren't here to talk about the US. If the dollar does not fulfill its role as reserve currency, then another currency will have to take its place, and there is one favorite candidate.
The euro is emerging as alternative safe haven along with bunds.
In this trade war, there will be no winners, only losers. But some will lose more, and some will lose less, and this is Europe's chance to lose the least. However, replacing the dollar is by no means a simple task, despite all of Donald Trump's efforts. So the question we all have to ask ourselves is obvious. Can the euro and European government bonds become the world's reserve assets? Today on Visualeconomik, we give you all the best arguments for and against this happening. Are you ready? Let's get started. For a currency to become a global reserve asset, there is one condition that must be met. It must be backed by a gigantic economy. The Swiss franc, for example, is a magnificent currency. It's so desirable that the Swiss central bank has to keep the money printing machine running so that it does not appreciate too much and generate deflation. But can you imagine the Swiss franc being the world's reserve currency? Obviously not. Can you tell me how an economy of fewer than 10 million people is going to be able to provide paper debt to satisfy everyone? And speaking of large countries, I'm sure many of you are thinking of another alternative to Europe. China. Could the Chinese yuan replace the dollar? The answer may sound blunt, but it is what it is. No. It could not. And while it's true that the yuan is increasingly used around the world, it has a fundamental difference with the dollar or the euro. You see, companies that trade internationally buy yuan, yes, but they try to get rid of it as quickly as possible, either by selling it in exchange for a commodity or exchanging it for another currency. So people buy yuan in order to trade with China, but after that, they don't hold on to those yuan. They don't use them as a reserve currency. This is not the case with the euro. It's true that its presence in the reserves of central banks around the world is much lower than that of the dollar, but in this case, we're talking about a reserve currency that no bank is afraid to keep on its balance sheet. What's more, China has a brutal trade surplus and tends to devalue its currency, which drives international investors away. But the most significant reason why the euro is the candidate for replacing the dollar and not the yuan is that China has something like a Peronist-style exchange rate trap. This affects ordinary Chinese citizens, but mostly it affects companies that want to move money in or out of the country. And yes, it is true that China has been relaxing these controls over time, especially for other countries surrounding it, but let's face it, without a free capital market, it is completely impossible for your currency to become an international reserve. So the only candidate left is the euro. The European Union is a giant economy, and today, it's the leading representative of institutional respect and rules-based international trade. Europe is also ramping up its debt issuance. Between next-generation funds, defense spending, and the new German stimulus package, the old continent is flooding the world with European debt. This is important for two reasons. The first has already been mentioned. The reserve currency has to be issued in enormous quantities. But as we've seen with China, a country not only has to be big, it also has to be willing to become the world's reserve issuer, with all the pros and cons that entails. The most obvious pro of doing this is that your debt gets cheaper, and believe me, Europe could use that in spades. So it's more likely that Europe will be more willing to take on this role now that it needs cheap debt. In fact, we're already seeing comments to that effect.
Euro has clear path towards greater reserve currency use.
And we're also seeing high-level profiles such as Ursula von der Leyen and Christine Lagarde talking about Europe's need to expand its capital markets and the digital euro. Yes, I know what many of you are thinking. What does the digital euro have to do with all this? The key is in the payment systems. When a European pays by card, he or she is most likely to use a Visa, and Visa is a US company. 2/3 of all credit card payments made in Europe use foreign companies such as Visa or MasterCard. What's more, half of the Euro countries don't even have a national system to handle these payments. And of course, even if the euro were to become the reserve currency, credit payments would still depend on US companies, which could also create a significant foreign exchange risk. But that's not all. There's already a fast and cheap alternative to companies like Visa: stablecoins. In case you've never heard of them, they are cryptocurrencies, but unlike Bitcoin, these tokens are managed by companies that are in charge of, put very simply, ensuring that their value remains stable, either by referencing the price to a currency in a 1-to-1 ratio, for example, or to commodities such as gold. Since their creation, the use of stablecoins has skyrocketed, and Europe fears being left behind. On top of that, let's not forget that all these stablecoins, or the most reliable ones at least, are basically backed by dollars and US debt, not euros. And so, the digital euro would potentially make it possible to manage all these payments without relying on third countries or cryptos. Although even today, many questions remain as to how it would be implemented. Will the digital euro be the key to making the euro the world's reserve currency? We don't know. In this matter, as we always say, we don't have a crystal ball. But if you allow me to make a comment, I believe that there are other obstacles much bigger than the payment system. Europe is not a country like the USA, but an alliance of countries that are very different from each other. For example, here you are looking at the debt composition of European countries. Only 3 of the 12 trillion euros in securities are rated AAA, and the same amount are rated BBB. Just imagine that Wisconsin declares tax rebellion and stops contributing to the US coffers. I know it sounds impossible, but the fact is that, even in this scenario, the federal government has 1,000 tools to prevent this problem from affecting the dollar. But now, imagine that a European country does that. And you don't have to stretch your imagination, because Greece has already threatened to do this very thing. What happened? Well, the market rushed to get rid of its euros. Okay, yes, in the end, nothing happened. Mario Draghi delivered his whatever it takes speech, and the markets calmed down. What's more, some people argue that, in fact, this fragmented structure is a plus for Europe. You know that it's very difficult to get European politicians to agree, and many laws need unanimity, or at least a 3/4 or 2/3 majority of the chamber. Well, this also applies to things like tariffs and capital controls. That is, in Europe, it is much more difficult to impose tariffs in the manner that Trump has done, overnight, and that difference could provide security to the markets. By the way, it's also not clear that Trump can legally do it, but, well, that's another story for Visualeconomik. Even so, not everything is as rosy as it sounds. It's true that Mario Draghi calmed the waters, but Greece's sovereign debt crisis inflicted a permanent wound on the euro. Europe did not definitively solve its currency problems, it simply kicked them forward. Since that speech, the euro has become a much more fragile currency. In the early 2000s, if a country like Greece had left the euro, what can I say? It would have been bad, but it would not have been an existential threat to the common currency. These days, the situation is very different, and if one country falls, it could drag the entire common currency project down with it. The reason that the European Central Bank has no effective way to punish countries that jeopardize their debt, especially with deficits. In theory, there is the Stability and Grow Pact, an agreement that prevents countries from taking on too much debt. Well, how long do you think it took for a country to get around that pact, and for Europe to do absolutely nothing? 4 years. And not just any country, but France and Germany. The words of Juncker, former president of the central bank, make this clear.
Asked why the Commission, on several occasions, had turned a blind eye to French infractions, Juncker admitted that it did so because it is France.
If you're a big country, you can skip the European pacts and nothing happens. And let's see, if you're a small one, then you might as well do the same. This has forced the European Central Bank to sweep problems under the rug instead of solving them. Hence, the euro has become more fragile. Let me give you another example. The ECB has a clear mission. Its only job is to control inflation. However, the market is well aware that, should it be necessary, the ECB is going to skip its role and bail out whoever requires it, even if that means more inflation in the Eurozone. And the case of Italy during the COVID pandemic was a good illustration of this. In March 2020, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates from 1.5 to 0%, but the European Central Bank did nothing. This spooked the markets. COVID was already a reality, and everyone expected the ECB to pull out all the stops with an ultra-relaxed monetary policy that would ease the fiscal situation of the countries. But as we've told you, that did not happen.
We are not here to close spreads. This is not the function or the mission of the ECB.
As a result, right after this speech, Italian debt had its largest single-day increase in its entire history, above its levels during the 2008 crisis or the 2012 financial crisis. I know this may sound a bit technical, but let me put it another way. The market was so sure that the central bank was going to skip its mandate to intervene in the economy that Italy's debt was artificially low. And don't think that the market was wrong either. After seeing the reaction of Italian debt, Christine Lagarde held another press conference to calm the markets, saying that they had misunderstood her and that the ECB would do whatever it takes to help member countries. Or, to put it another way, European debt has become addicted to central bank policy, and the market knows it. Now think of a crisis like the one in 2008. The US Federal Reserve reacted by providing liquidity lines to everyone, and Europe stuck its head in the sand. It was right at this moment that the old continent lost the possibility of becoming the world's reserve currency. As Uncle Ben said, with great power comes great responsibility. And Europe was not willing to take on the responsibility of acting as lender of last resort to the rest of the world. Well, now the situation would be even worse, because if there is such a crisis, European countries will have two options. Either they use monetary policy to stabilize their economy, or that of the rest of the world. And we've already seen with Italy that if the ECB does not intervene, European countries could have a very, very bad time. So they're unlikely to be willing to sacrifice for the rest of the world. Donald Trump has shaken confidence in the dollar, but the euro has its own problems. Right now, France has a brutal deficit that does not plan to bring it to the 2% threshold, even by 2030. The German economy, the driver of Europe, is stagnating. According to the Bundesbank, it will only grow by 2% over the next 8 years. Take note, we're not talking about 2% each year, which would be normal to low. We're talking about 2% during those entire 8 years. And on top of this forecast, we must add that Trump's tariffs are going to hit exporting countries such as Germany particularly hard. And Spain is only growing due to immigration and government spending. In other words, the main Euro countries are constipated. If what happened in Greece in 2012 was bad enough, what happens in the future could be much, much worse. The European Central Bank can intervene, and is in fact already intervening indirectly, so that the difference in the price of the debt of these countries becomes smaller. This would make it easier to issue Eurobonds, which is debt in the name of the entire European Union as a whole. But let's be honest, no matter how much making up the central bank does, without stronger fundamentals, it is very hard to imagine that the dollar can be replaced.
Low bond spreads only attract safe asset investment if they are earned by fundamentals, not when they are artificially supported by central bank intervention. European institutions should prioritize transparency, predictability, and stability, not complex window dressing.
In short, the dollar is experiencing capital flight, and those capitals are taking refuge in the euro and German bonds. This makes sense. If one currency has to replace the dollar, it would be the euro. Of this there is no doubt. However, it's one thing to serve as a short-term safe haven and quite another to do away with the dollar. And that would be very difficult to achieve with the current state of the euro. Without clear mechanisms to control deficits and coordinate all countries, the market simply cannot be trusted. On top of that, it isn't clear that Europe is willing to accept all that comes with being the world's reserve currency. On the one hand, cheap debt would come in handy, but with the fragility of the European system, well, what can I say? Most likely, if there is a crisis, the governments and the central bank will be too busy trying to solve the situation in the old continent to offer credit lines to other countries. But having come this far, now it's your turn. Is the dollar really in danger? Is Europe willing to become the lender of last resort during crises, and to make all the necessary reforms to make the euro as stable as the dollar? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you soon.